Okay. Earlier in the day, I was talking with Lois, who just came on right now, about the subject du jour, which is the Supreme Court's letter outlining a path to overturning Roe v. Wade. And during our conversation, I was suggesting that what is missing, and I'm not the only person to notice this, what is missing is a forum where people can actually share ideas, and that this is something that has been missing for quite some time in our lives as Americans. There really isn't, for many hotly debated subjects, they're not really hotly debated, they're shouted. There's not a real forum for the exchange of ideas, or at least a forum where people can safely state their beliefs and not get attacked. So and I was suggesting that this discussion about abortion, it's not a discussion, this battle over abortion is something like that. And that in some ways you have people that are engaged in a battle, sort of playing chicken as they get close to the precipice of some cliff, and are so insistent on not listening, not giving an inch, not having discussion, that you could imagine the two sides just like in each other's grip, going over the side of a cliff, because they just refused to allow for conversation. So I'm going to share my own personal experience with you, and I'm sharing it because I think it shows that there is another way, even though it's not a perfect way. It's not like Desmond Tutu's Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa or something. This just shows that there is such a thing as a community like that about these kinds of feelings, even though it doesn't really exactly show how to do it. So about 30 years ago, my wife was pregnant, and she was about 6 months pregnant when she had an ultrasound, and the ultrasound showed that the baby had water on the brain, hydroencephalus. And after consulting with doctors, they told us that the baby will not live. The baby will live to birth probably, but the baby cannot survive outside the mother's womb. And so with certainty, they said the baby will die within a few days, a day or two of birth. And this was the consensus of all the doctors that we went to. So Tzippi has the prospect of continuing a pregnancy, even though she knows the baby is not viable. So there was a rabbi in Jerusalem who was revered around the world. His name was Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Aurbach, of blessed memory. And his status was the highest status of rabbinic, halachic authority. And somebody suggested to us that we should ask him about it, because there was a rumor that he allowed for what they call therapeutic abortion of a fetus, in a baby, in this kind of a circumstance. So my brother, one of my brothers in Israel, my brother, called this rabbi who he was friendly with, who himself was close to Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Aurbach, and that rabbi agreed to be like the go-between. And so we told him all the details, and he spoke to Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Aurbach, and Rabbi Shlomo Zalman said that Tzipi could have a therapeutic abortion. The justification for it was that it would, in the opinion of the doctors, the baby has no chance to survive, and that it would cause emotional stress to Tzipi, to carry it for those next few months. And so that was it. Right, but the way they do the therapeutic abortion is they just induce labor. So, but the baby's not going to live after the baby's born, but they induce labor. That's how they do it in that case. So, so we proceeded to have a late, what is considered a late term abortion. And the way it worked in Israel at the time, again, this is 30 years ago, was that there were only certain hospitals that did abortions. One of them was Hadassah in Ein Kerem. And what you did was you applied to obviously the doctors apply for you, but you apply to the hospital to do an abortion. And then there's an ethics committee, and they interview you, and then they make a determination if you should have the abortion, and then they allow for the abortion. So we went through that process. Again, they don't care if it's halachic or not, they don't care if I asked a rabbi, it's an abortion, it's an abortion. So, we went through that process, and they allowed for the abortion. And so what happens is you go to the hospital, you go to the maternity ward, and you're induced for labor, just like you were going if you're going for a regular birth. And then the idea is that after the baby's born, they're going to take care of it. The baby's going to die, and then they're going to take care of it. So this is, how we prepared for it. We emotionally prepared for the experience. And we went there, and there were friends who came to be with Tzipi while it was going on. I was there. One of the friends who came was a neighbor who was a very spiritual lady. And spiritual that crossed over into like new age remedies and things like that, that kind of spiritual. And so they induced Tzipi, but labor wasn't kicking in. And so she said to me, I should call this different rabbi, who was also a very respected rabbi, because this rabbi had remedies. He has remedies for things, and he has remedies for getting labor to kick in. He has one of his well-known remedies, which I think involves drinking mother's milk or something like that. These are somewhat bizarre, these remedies. I don't really like doing that stuff. And my attitude towards those kind of things, because in the religious community, the kind of things do move around. There is like an open door between the religious community and people who do these other kind of home homeopathic things and grandmothers kind of remedies for things.
Yeah, hop on one foot for 20 minutes.
Right. And
hop on the other.
my general attitude is if, like if Tzippy was insistent, I would do it. But otherwise, I'm not doing these kind of things. But this woman essentially at one point just said to me, your wife, you do this for your wife. You don't want to do it, but do it for your wife. So what you do is, his name was Rabbi Yisroel Yaakov Fisher. Rabbi Yisroel Yaakov Fisher, and he was the head of a rabbinical court called the Badatz in Jerusalem, and he was also a very revered rabbinic authority. Now, the way it worked with him is, you call his house, and his wife answers, and she listens to your question. Then supposedly, she puts down the phone and goes and asks her husband, and then comes back with her husband's answers. People are not sure if she's always, going to her husband, because people are pretty sure that a lot of times she's just answering it herself. But she always
heard it 100 times
right.
anyway.
So she puts the phone down and then comes back to it. So I called her and I told her the circumstances as they were, the entire circumstances. And she puts down the phone, she goes and speaks to her husband, she comes back and she said, my husband said that he can't give you this remedy because what you're doing is murder and he can't enable a murder. So at the time, I'm just thinking to myself, why? I didn't want to make this call in the first place.
Yep.
And why did I do it? But anyways, it was important that I hear that. So at some point, the labor does kick in and the baby is born, and the baby's born, the baby dies shortly after the baby is born. We did not see the baby. I mean, we saw the baby for a second and they took the baby away. I was told that the Chaver Kadisha takes over and they take the baby and then they bury the baby. They don't tell you where they bury the baby, but the Department of Health knows where it is or whatever. And I had to go sign a death certificate. I had to
a name or no name? No
name. This happened, a different situation happened where we had a baby that we weren't expecting to pass away, that was alive for a day.
Right.
That baby I named, because that baby, it was on Shabbos, and I went to, it was in Shari Tzedek, and they had a minyan. So that one I named, but this one I didn't name. And that was the end of that story. Obviously, we lived in a neighborhood where everybody knew each other, and so and my wife had lots of friends, and there was lots of comforting. But within the community that takes the law halacha very seriously, I lived and continue to live in a community that takes the law very seriously. There was this divide. And somehow these opinions could live with, with people who had very strong opinions about it. You could have these two opinions.
Absolutely.
And one opinion was, this is the right thing to do. And the other opinion was, this is murder. And they somehow both, they don't just survive together. They didn't. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Aurbach and Rabbi Yisroel Yaakov Fisher, they admire each other. And yet they have these,
agree all the time.
They do not agree about the difference between something that is considered murder and something that is considered, and whether it's considered advisable. It wasn't just that it was permitted, he was sort of acknowledging or advising that this is the right thing to do. That's how we received that opinion at the time. And the society itself, like in Israel, there were posters there about issues that people disagreed about. I remember autopsies. There were very strong opinions about whether autopsies should be done or not be done in Israel. And I remember posters going up, sort of graphic posters against autopsies. And there were even sort of strident debates about burial sites. Like if they found an ancient cemetery and somebody wanted to build a hotel there. In Israel, if you want to build something, you have to pay for an excavation of that area. And if they find that it was a Jewish gravesite, there are people that protest because of a desecration of Jewish gravesite. And those protests can look pretty angry, when they're happening, but there's somehow a space for that, for people who have disagreement, and even strong disagreement, and there is some kind of space that allows for people to vent their feelings and
remain friends.
And somehow remain friends. And I remember when I was a kid, I was like 13, so I don't know, it was in the like 74, I think. My parents are divorced, and my mother got tickets for the Bolshoi Ballet in Milwaukee. So my sister and I were going to the Bolshoi Ballet. At the same time, my father was a Hillel director, and he was protesting the Bolshoi Ballet because of for Soviet Jewry, for Soviet Jewry.
That was very strong at that time.
Right. So for like an hour before the ballet, I was with my father protesting the ballet. And then my mother got there, and I went in and watched the Bolshoi Ballet. And yeah, and I remember that while we were marching for Soviet Jewry, there was another group called Youth Against Fascists and War. They were like a socialist group, and they were protesting against the protesters.
Correct. Of course.
So you had Jews who were protesting about Soviet Jewry and against the Soviet Union. And then you had this other group, Youth Against Fascists and War, who were protesting against the protest. And they were all Jewish. The Youth Against Fascists and War were all Jewish. There might have been one or two people that weren't, but they were almost all Jewish. And everybody knew each other. And you hear people like back and forth. I was at your bar mitzvah. Like one of these. Yeah, why? How can you protest against this? Don't you? These are your Jewish brethren. And there's like stuff going back and forth, like in the as the protest is going on. And again, there were raised voices. It's impassioned, raised voices about people that are expressing things that are very dear to them, but somehow they're all walking near each other and sort of yelling at each other, and also, they know each other.
Throwing rocks.
No, and she went to his bar mitzvah, and she'll probably go to his wedding. It was like that kind of thing. And again, you could have very strongly held opinions, and not necessarily an answer to the disagreement, right? But at least some kind of shared space where the conversation can happen that allows for a recognition of each other's humanity, while the whole thing is happening,
Right.
and not a sense that, I guess what I feel is different in this discussion and some of the other discussions that we're having is that it goes to the point where we want to get rid of the other group.
Yeah.
As opposed to it can somehow living with the fact that
We're
we
communicating with
right.
each other.
I remember-
Communication is totally gone.
Right. And what is different, qualitatively, it's not always easy to say. I remember one time when I was in Israel, also around that same time, there was an election. Elections in Israel are ridiculously vitriolic. They're extremely vitriolic. And there was a new party, a new religious party that was representing the yeshiva community, which I was a part of, what you call it, Haredi Litvaks. And they eventually got 2 seats in the Knesset. But the way it works at Israeli elections is you're allowed to send monitors to each election site from your party. So at a particular election site, which might be a school, a public school, where there's different rooms are different voting areas like they have here. So you'd have that there, except you'd have some folding chairs and you'd have people that are observers from the party. Now, you're not an official member of the party necessarily. You can volunteer and be an observer. I had a friend who was organizing it in our area and I agreed to be an observer. So I was, one particular day, I was at a polling site and I was there with some other people that were observers from other parties. And in Israel, again, if you're part of a party, it's a parliamentary system. Even small parties have representation and can make an impact. And they tend to be loud, I guess, because you have to be loud. The feeling is you have to be loud to get heard in that kind of a system. So you had people with very stark opinions sitting in those chairs at this nondescript polling site in some school in Neve Yaakov, a suburb of Jerusalem. And so I was one of them. And there were a couple other people. And you're sitting there all day and you get to know each other. You start schmoozing with each other. You get to know each other. Now, I would not meet this person regularly in my everyday life, but now we're all sitting together in these chairs and we're schmoozing with each other. And
there could be 12 of you.
Right. I think there were more like 6 or 8. And I don't know what I said. Somehow we were having a discussion and I quoted something, maybe from Shakespeare or something, just as like a quote, just something. And I saw this lady, she's looking like astonished. And I didn't know what had happened initially, but she's just staring at me. And then she said something like, did you just quote Shakespeare? And it was like, how would you possibly know Shakespeare or something like that? And then we're having we end up having this conversation, and it's the kind of thing you could write a short story about, a day like that.
Yeah,
and the thing is, in Israel, that can happen for a lot of different reasons. You could be sitting next to somebody on a bus who thinks that your child is not dressed warmly enough, and then suddenly you have a conversation or whatever. But in Israel, again, even though a lot of people would think that the way they talk about the Haredi and the secular community in Israel,
they're constantly at each other's throats.
Right. And there are people that have great, despair, but my experience has been that although there's for sure it's just terrible when there isn't tolerance for each other, but there's somehow that it's still able to there is some kind of what we'll call coexistence.
Yeah.
And therefore there's even kind of maybe reluctant on some people's behalf, but there's kind of listening every once in a while. Like I remember listening to Rivlin when he, in his previous incarnation, when he was the head of his own party, that there was a large party in the Knesset. Not Rivlin. The one who's going to take over as prime minister now. What's his name?
Oh.
But it's Bennett and
Bennett.
Lapid.
Oh.
Lapid.
Oh, really?
Yeah. No. So
Didn't hear
Lapid.
that one.
So Lapid. I remember him, talking about the Haredi community, and saying, like there's a change been happening. There's a change with the army. There's a change with Haredi people in the workplace that is allowing for a kind of social change and integration that they didn't, at first people didn't think was possible. From the secular side, that there were people that just couldn't imagine there being a kind of integration. But the army, more and more, it's not as much as people want, but it's more and more. And in the workplace, there's been, because you don't need college degrees in order to enter Israeli, you used to. If you wanted to be a professional of any kind, obviously you needed a college degree. Haredim can't get college degrees because they don't go to college. And they also don't go to high schools that teach the Bagrut, which allows you, this test that you have to pass in order to go to college. So there was a barrier for Haredim to become professionals. But now in a new society that's built on startups and all sorts of computers and all sorts of fields that don't require college education as an entry. So you have a large segment of the Haredi community that is integrating more into Israeli society. So my experience, even, and walking around, I'm identified as a Haredi Jew in Israel, and walking around in secular society, I've had many interactions with people that is not I don't see it here in the areas of divide where, let's say, where abortion is part of it, or some of the other political issues that we have, that sense of common space and a kind of allowing for different people to have strongly held different opinions about things that really matter in a way that you feel like there is a context for healthy life and interactive kind of healthy life in the future.
Without the
right. So and if my own personal work in this issue is to recognize the humanity of people I don't agree with, which I think is a step that we can take as individuals, that and to sort of focus, to make it an effort at least once a day to look around the room at, if I'm in a room with a bunch of different people, look at each person and say, I love this person, or I want to love this person. And
a jerk.
Right. And even, and to actually make that effort for me personally, because that space cannot exist if I'm not part of creating the space for that to exist. So if there are people, even people that I strongly disagree with and who don't like me, and I don't like them.
Who couldn't like you?
Right. That's what my mother says. But to recognize first and foremost that they are a human being, that I cannot live without them, that we need each other. in many ways, that we absolutely need each other, that we cannot move on without each other. And to start from that place, it doesn't remove the areas of disagreement or even the hard feelings about it, but it's a necessary feature. So this week's Torah portion is the Torah portion of Kedoshim. And it starts off, Kedoshim Tiyu, be a holy people. And the first thing it talks about is being in awe of your parents, having awe for your parents. And Rav Shimshon Hirsch, in other words, what is a holy society? So it begins with being in awe of your parents, recognizing and being in awe of Shabbos. There's our kind of horizontal relationships, our vertical relationships. Love your neighbor, rebuke your fellow if you think that they're doing something that's wrong. Don't stand by while the blood of your fellow is spilled. Don't take vengeance against your fellow. Don't feel jealous. These kind of things are all in this area. But Rav Shimshon Hirsch, in blessed memory, in his commentary on the Chumash, on the Torah, he says that it's not enough to tell children that they have to have awe for you. That's not going to work. It's not going to work just to tell your children, it says in the Torah, you're supposed to have awe for me. We have to create a context that allows them
to understand what it is.
Right. And there has to be some kind of context that allows for them, encourages them to have awe for the parents. There is a responsibility for children to have awe for their parents, but you can't, it's not going to be reality if society doesn't make it a priority to have a context for children to be in awe of parents. So it's the responsibility of the adults to make sure that that's in place. And you could extend that to all the other kinds of expectations that the Torah has for a holy society. That part of a holy society is, in the beginnings of a holy society, are people that are dedicated to making sure that the community is a community that has the possibility of loving each other, has the possibility of people looking out for each other and rebuking each other. It's important that people feel comfortable to do that and not to stand by when the blood of their brother is spilled. And I think that Israeli society in particular, most people's experience there is that this is still there, that, I might disagree with you, but if you're in trouble, I'm there for you. Even when I was mentioning before my trip, all the efforts to get Tzipi's passport, with the Israeli government, and how you can't even get an appointment or anything. But several of my friends said to me at the same time, somehow it's going to work out in the end, because they don't leave you stranded. They annoy you up until the point, but then when you need it, they're there for you. And that is what happened there. And I've been in Israeli taxis where the taxi driver finds something that somebody left behind, and the two of us were trying to figure out who this person was and calling the person and bringing them there. One time Tzipi was on a bus, another Tzipi pregnant story, but she was on a bus and the bus stopped suddenly and she fell. She was standing, and she fell. And the bus driver saw that she fell. He told everybody to get off the bus. This was a city bus. He told everybody to get off the bus and he drove her straight to the hospital.
You're kidding.
No.
Wow.
And there's
That's
all
impressive.
right. And there's all sorts of circumstances. I'm not saying there's never an exception to this,
Well,
but I'm
yeah.
saying it's enough where it's part of the legend of Israel, the Sabra legend, where they're rough on the outside but sweet on the inside.
It's a very small country and it's all we got.
Right. But as people but mainly this, that it is possible. I know it is possible for people to have the strongest of opinions and to be people of great character who care deeply about their principles, but somehow, again, are able to live in community with others. And this is, I believe, part of the necessary first step of creating a holy community is making sure that this is possible. And if we notice that it is not, what is our call? I'm going to suggest, while this is going on and we're upset about this, what are we supposed to do about it? So I think that this is something that we comfortably can say that we need to do about it, which is to make sure that in our communities, in our family, in our relationships with friends, that it's possible for people to disagree with each other strongly and still get together. My father told over the story on Pesach about his Uncle Max. He had an Uncle Maxwell. And Maxwell, this was a story I heard from my grandfather. My father told it over. My Uncle Maxwell, my great Uncle Maxwell, was an atheist. And he used to come to the Seder. He didn't just come to the Seder, but according to my grandfather, he would bring his atheist books to the Seder. But somehow Uncle Maxwell was still at the Seder, right? And as annoying as he was to everybody else at the Seder, he was still at the Seder. Would everybody rather he wasn't an atheist and didn't bring his atheistic books to the Seder? They would have done it anyway. Right? And he had a place at the Seder together with everybody else. And the four sons at the Seder, the four sons include one that everybody else thinks is a Russia, a wicked son, but he's still, he's still at the Seder. So somehow it is possible to have a context like that, and we're called upon to make such a context. And that's my feeling about this as we're having the discussion, and the pain the deep pain that many people are feeling about what's going on with abortion and the Supreme Court, that maybe to hear it as a calling to make sure that in our communities, you can have disagreement, but still live together and work together towards the things that matter most. All right.